We are at part 2 of our chicken feeding series. Today we're getting into how do you actually feed your chickens? What's your feeding strategy? Do you feed them as much as they like all day long, or do you feed them at meal times? And we're going to talk about soaking and fermenting feed so you can get the most out of every bag. The two most common strategies for feeding your flock is called ad-lib feeding, which is where you have feed for your chickens available all the time. It's a similar way to people often feed their cats. There's just always a bowl of food. For chickens, there's always some kind of feeder that they can get to, and hopefully rodents and wild birds can't get into, but there's all sorts of different feeders for that strategy. That's a really easy one. You just have to make sure there is food in their feeder and you don't have to worry about it anymore. And then the second strategy is to do meal feeding, where you feed your chickens a set number of times per day at hopefully set times, because chickens are creatures of habit. So I choose meal feeding because that works for me in my situation. They get a meal in the morning and they get a meal in the afternoon, and for the rest of the day they're cruising around picking at grass and all the rest of it. Now, if I had a different setup or I had time constraints where that wouldn't work for me, I would look at the ad-lib feeding or a combination of the two. Neither of these strategies is better or worse than the other. Your chickens are going to get fed no matter which one you pick, and you can also combine them together to get the best of both worlds. The positives to ad-lib feeding is that it works for busy schedules, or if you have an inconsistent schedule, your chickens are always going to be fed, so you don't have to worry if you're running late for their afternoon feeding or anything like that. It can also reduce waste if used carefully in a feeder where wild birds and rodents and things can't get into it. And it's a way to sort of collect up all of the dust and things that kind of falls to the bottom of the pan. You can tip that out of the feeder and use it potentially for a meal feeding strategy every once in a while. So it's a really good way of getting a really good amount out of your feed bag. But it does have some negatives, and the negatives are it can increase waste if you're not careful about collecting the fines. Your chickens can throw feed all around out of it if they're not that into it. And it's quite difficult to tell if your flock is getting enough food or if they're getting too much food, because it's hard to judge exactly how much they're eating unless you're like really, really on it and you know exactly how much you're putting in and how many days it's lasting. So it's a little harder to sort of get an idea of how much your flock is eating when you're using constantly available feed. Set mealtime feeding has some positives and negatives to it as well. And the positives are it's really easy to tell if you're feeding your flock too much or not enough, because you can see how into it they are and whether they're leaving anything behind after sort of a set period of time after mealtime. So that's a great way to not be overfeeding your flock. But you're going to need a lot more feeding stations than a constant ad-lib feeder, because all your chickens need to be able to get to their food at mealtime when the more dominant chickens are like, go away, this is all my food. So for my flock of, we're around 20 birds at the moment, I have something like 9 or 10 feeding stations so that they all can get in and get their food. So that is something to keep in mind. You probably need, depending on how well your chickens get along with each other, you're going to need sort of one feeding area per about 2 birds, so you are sure that they're getting everything that they need. It can be a great way to reduce waste, particularly if you feed your feed a little bit wet, because they're going to come in, they're going to eat it all up, and they're not going to leave much behind, ideally, if you've got them fed at the right volume. And we're going to talk about feeding wet feed in just a moment when we talk about soaking and fermenting. So to summarize that, neither method is any better or worse than the other. You can mix and match them and just pick the one that's going to work the best for you in your own situation with your own schedule. The birds are going to be just fine. Now, always remember that your flock needs to have clean drinking water, and if you have more than a few chickens, you want to provide 2 water stations or more so that no bossy hen can set up and prevent other hens from getting to the water. And just a reminder that laying hens always need to have calcium available, whether that's oyster shell or limestone, so that they can be getting the calcium that they need no matter what feeding strategy you're deciding to use. Let's talk about soaking and fermenting feed. Now, I always feed a portion of my chickens' meals as a wet feed. Now, that's either soaked or fermented, depending on how long it's been sitting in my soaking bucket. I don't set up elaborate strategies of days and buckets. It just goes in, it's in there for a few days, depending on whether it's summer or winter. It takes longer or shorter to get fermenting. And it's either soaked if it's the day after I've just done it, or fermented if it's a couple of days after that. So you don't have to worry too much about it. You can get into the nitty-gritty, or you can just roll with it. Fermented feed can improve the digestibility of the food from dry. So a dry feed, your chickens are going to eat it, it's going to be good for them, but fermenting it can help improve its digestibility because it's soaking it, it's softening it up, so a chicken's digestive system can get really everything out of it. And there is research showing that when you ferment something, it does make certain nutrients more available in the diet. But what fermenting and soaking absolutely doesn't do is increase the energy of the food. So what goes in is gonna come out at the same energy, even though it's bulked up. So do keep that in mind. It's not something that's going to save you, like you can't put half the amount of feed for your chickens just because it bulks up twice as big. It doesn't have more energy than the dry food. Really important to remember, because I have seen quite a few people get a bit confused on that, where they're feeding the same kind of volume, not realizing that the soaked feed, while it's a bigger volume, isn't higher in energy and probably isn't higher in protein either. So you've got to be mindful your chickens are getting enough food. But it does reduce waste by sticking everything together and stopping things from blowing away or getting biffed out. And chickens, I find, prefer their food to be a bit moist, a little bit wet, than they do just dry feed. So what kind of feed can you ferment? Well, technically you can soak or ferment any feed, even a pellet feed or a crumble. Personally, I like to ferment a whole grain crushed up type feed, which is what I have here. This is the feed that I feed to my chicken flock. It's just a whole bunch of grains and peas and things, and it's got their multiple vitamin mineral mix and stuff in there as well. So that is what I do. I just put it from the dry feed into my soaking bucket, and this is just a compost bin. Because when you're soaking and fermenting, you want to have a lid on, but you don't want the lid to be sealed, because as things ferment, they start to create some gases. So you don't want the pressure to build up under your lid. So this is a non-sealing lid. Air can get in and out, so that's fine, but nothing can fall in. No critters can come and get into your bin and get into trouble. So it just solves that problem. And this goes for maybe 3 days for my flock, and I sort of top it up as I go, and when it gets quite low, then I just start again, refill it, and off we go. So all I do when I'm mixing up feed for my chickens is to just take the wet feed out and put it into my feeding bowl, which is just a regular stainless steel kitchen bowl. Put the wet feed into the bowl, and then put the dry feed in over the top. Now I add, if we weren't doing it here on camera to show you, I add my blood and bone meal into it as well. Mix it all together, and that's what they get for their meals, which they get twice a day. So they get this in the morning, they get this in the afternoon, and that is their major diet. And of course they roam around and forage a lot, and forage is what we're talking about in the final installment of this series, which is coming next week. And here is Astarion coming to see why on earth I am making feed out here instead of at the feed shed. And he's calling his lady babies over for this unexpected bounty because they've already had their afternoon feed today. So that's the nuts and bolts on how you actually get your flock fed, how you go from the feed shed out to the yard. There are so many options. Make it work for you. The important thing is that your chickens get fed and that you're remembering that they need clean water, calcium for the laying hens, and that they have enough protein in their diet. Those are the main things. Tick those off and they'll be very, very happy. Next week, we're going to talk about all the things chickens might need or want in their diet that doesn't come out of the feed bag. We're going to talk about kitchen scraps, we're going to talk about things you can grow in the garden or buy, and we're going to talk about forage, so grass and things like that, and how to store it when there's lots of it so you can feed it in the winter or the summer when there's not a lot of it. So I look forward to seeing you next week when we unpack all of that stuff.